The volatile spring of 1859 brought unprecedented river traffic through the White River system as families fled the escalating violence of bleeding Kansas and pre-Civil War territorial disputes, while Missouri's position as contested borderland between free and slave states created conditions of social chaos that disrupted traditional relationships between human communities and the supernatural. Forces governing natural waterways. Captain Jeremiah Blackwood's 45 years of steamboat operations throughout the Arkansas and Missouri Ozarks had provided comprehensive understanding of seasonal river conditions, while his decade of commercial navigation through treacherous White River channels established reliable cargo routes whose stability was now threatened by mysterious phenomena that exceeded normal environmental variations. The subtle environmental changes that initially characterized supernatural awakening included navigation anomalies, whose characteristics exceeded normal seasonal variations, while familiar channel markers disappeared overnight, and river currents shifted without corresponding changes in water level or weather conditions. The changes created navigation hazards, while atmospheric conditions throughout river system demonstrated supernatural rather than purely natural influence, whose recognition required acknowledgement of otherworldly forces affecting regional waterway conditions through intelligent, rather than random environmental manipulation whose purposes remained unclear but increasingly ominous. Little Owl's Cherokee heritage provided crucial understanding of ancient spiritual relationships between indigenous populations and water entities, whose territorial authority predated European settlement, while his 68 years of traditional knowledge preserved awareness of proper protocols for maintaining respectful coexistence with supernatural forces governing natural waterways. His warnings to Captain Blackwood included systematic explanation of spiritual territorial boundaries, while acknowledging that increased human intrusion and environmental disruption had created optimal conditions for ancient water spirits to reassert territorial claims through methods that transcended normal animal behavior to encompass genuine supernatural intervention. The dead fish manifestations that characterized early supernatural activity included systematic arrangement in geometric patterns whose precision exceeded normal mortality events, while their positioning suggested intelligent rather than random causation that challenged conventional explanation through evidence of otherworldly rather than purely natural phenomena affecting river ecosystem. The arrangements created immediate environmental evidence, while their consistent repetition throughout multiple river locations demonstrated coordinated rather than isolated supernatural activity whose scope exceeded individual entity capabilities through systematic territorial marking and psychological warfare deployment. The first confirmed serpent encounter that validated Little Owl's warnings occurred during routine cargo transport, when Captain Blackwood's crew witnessed enormous creature surface near Devil's Backbone Narrows while demonstrating behavior that exceeded normal animal activity through calculated psychological intimidation rather than simple feeding or territorial defense. The creature's 60-foot length exceeded known aquatic species, while its sustained pursuit of steamboat over multiple river miles demonstrated intelligence and purposeful stalking, whose characteristics suggested supernatural rather than purely animal motivation for human contact and territorial display. The psychological warfare aspects that distinguished supernatural serpent behavior from normal predation included systematic terror deployment, whose effectiveness exceeded accidental intimidation through calculated visibility and timing designed to maximize human fear response rather than achieve efficient elimination. The behavior demonstrated strategic intelligence, while creatures' ability to remain partially visible throughout extended pursuit created optimal psychological impact that served territorial assertion rather than nutritional objectives through supernatural understanding of human psychology and fear manipulation techniques. The historical context that provided optimal conditions for supernatural awakening included pre-Civil War social disruption and increased human movement through previously isolated wilderness areas, while territorial disputes and environmental exploitation created conditions that challenged traditional spiritual agreements between human communities and otherworldly entities governing natural resources. The context included systematic violation of indigenous territorial protocols, while European settlement patterns ignored traditional spiritual boundaries whose maintenance required ongoing acknowledgement of supernatural authority over specific geographical regions and natural resource access. The crew testimony that documented supernatural encounter characteristics included systematic observation of creature behavior, whose intelligence exceeded normal animal response patterns, while its deliberate psychological manipulation demonstrated supernatural understanding of human psychology and strategic deployment of terror as territorial assertion method. The testimony provided credible documentation, while crew members' professional riverboat experience validated observations of anomalous behavior that transcended normal wildlife encounters through evidence of otherworldly intelligence and purposeful human targeting rather than accidental contact or defensive response. The environmental omens that preceded direct supernatural encounters included atmospheric disturbances and wildlife behavior modifications whose characteristics suggested impending otherworldly manifestation, while traditional Cherokee knowledge provided interpretive framework for understanding spiritual communication through natural phenomena. The omens included systematic bird migration disruption and atmospheric pressure variations, while river water temperature fluctuations created evidence of supernatural influence over environmental conditions, whose modifications served territorial assertion and psychological preparation for direct supernatural intervention. The steamboat navigation challenges that increased supernatural presence created included systematic interference with mechanical operations and compass reliability, while vessel performance degradation exceeded normal mechanical explanation through otherworldly influence over technological systems. The challenges demonstrated supernatural ability to affect human technology, while creating optimal conditions for creature encounters through reduced human defensive capabilities and enhanced vulnerability to supernatural predation, whose strategic deployment revealed planning and coordination that exceeded individual entity intelligence through collective rather than purely individual. Supernatural capabilities. The community awareness development that characterized regional response to mounting supernatural evidence included systematic recognition among river communities that environmental conditions exceeded normal seasonal variations, while traditional folklore provided explanatory framework for understanding otherworldly phenomena affecting regional transportation and commercial activity. The awareness included consultation with indigenous knowledge sources, while acknowledgement of supernatural reality required revision of conventional safety protocols and defensive measures, whose effectiveness against otherworldly threats remained uncertain despite obvious need for enhanced protective procedures. The territorial assertion patterns that early supernatural manifestations revealed included systematic demonstration of creature presence throughout major White River tributaries, while coordinated activity suggested hierarchical organization and strategic territorial control that exceeded individual animal capabilities. The patterns included Buffalo River, Current River, and Jack's Fork tributary manifestations, while systematic coverage of major waterway access points demonstrated comprehensive territorial claiming whose scope exceeded normal animal territory establishment through supernatural rather than purely biological territorial marking and boundary enforcement. The indigenous spiritual interpretation that Little Owl provided included systematic explanation of water spirit, territorial authority, and traditional protocols for maintaining respectful coexistence, while acknowledging that European settlement patterns had systematically violated spiritual agreements whose maintenance required ongoing acknowledgement of otherworldly authority over natural resources. The interpretation included understanding of underwater panther Mishibizhiw spiritual significance, while recognition of creature characteristics suggested corrupted rather than traditional manifestation whose malevolence exceeded normal water spirit behavior through centuries of accumulated resentment and territorial violation. The commercial disruption that mounting supernatural activity created included systematic interference with steamboat cargo operations, while psychological impact on crew performance reduced transportation reliability throughout regional river system, whose economic importance exceeded local community survival to encompass broader territorial development and commercial connectivity. The disruption demonstrated supernatural understanding of human economic dependency, while strategic targeting of commercial rather than purely residential activity suggested sophisticated analysis of human social organization and optimal pressure points for territorial assertion and psychological intimidation. The escalation patterns that characterized advancing supernatural threat included systematic increase in encounter frequency and creature visibility, while behavioral modifications suggested adaptive learning and strategic refinement based on human response patterns. The escalation included enhanced psychological warfare deployment, while creature intelligence enabled tactical modification whose effectiveness exceeded original intimidation methods through ongoing assessment of human vulnerability and defensive capabilities whose limitation enabled optimal supernatural exploitation for territorial control and human elimination through systematic terror rather than direct assault. As Captain Jeremiah Blackwood's steamboat operations encountered systematic supernatural interference, while Little Owl's Cherokee spiritual knowledge provided interpretive framework for understanding ancient water spirits, whose territorial authority predated European settlement, and whose awakening challenged conventional understanding of regional navigation safety. The environmental omens and direct creature encounters throughout White River system had created recognition that traditional folklore accurately described otherworldly entities, whose intelligence and territorial claims exceeded normal animal behavior, while requiring acknowledgement of supernatural reality and appropriate respectful protocols, whose violation might escalate supernatural intervention. From psychological intimidation toward direct elimination of human presence through systematic aquatic predation whose scope threatened entire regional transportation infrastructure. The systematic family targeting that characterized supernatural Serpent Dynasty operational methodology included coordinated attacks against specific human bloodlines whose elimination demonstrated otherworldly memory capabilities and vengeful purpose that transcended normal animal territorial behavior through multi-generational persecution patterns whose persistence exceeded individual creature lifespans. The Mitchell family became primary documentation case for kinship cruelty phenomenon, when Serpent Brood began systematic elimination of Sarah Mitchell's extended relatives across multiple White River settlements while demonstrating supernatural intelligence and strategic coordination whose effectiveness exceeded normal predatory behavior through calculated psychological warfare and prolonged victim torture designed to maximize terror impact. Sarah Mitchell's 32 years of frontier life along Buffalo River tributary had provided comprehensive understanding of normal wildlife dangers, while her family's three-generation settlement history created extensive kinship networks throughout regional river communities whose economic interdependency enabled mutual support during typical frontier hardships. The family's prosperity through successful farming and river commerce created optimal target profile for supernatural predation, while their social prominence ensured maximum psychological impact throughout regional community, whose survival depended upon mutual assistance and collaborative defensive measures against both human and environmental threats. The coordinated serpent attacks that characterized dynasty hunting methodology included simultaneous manifestations across multiple river locations, while individual brood members demonstrated inherited supernatural abilities whose combination enabled comprehensive territorial coverage and systematic victim processing that exceeded normal predatory efficiency. The coordination included real-time communication between family members whose supernatural connection enabled tactical adaptation and strategic response modification based on human defensive measures, while collective intelligence exceeded individual creature capabilities through shared consciousness and accumulated hunting experience. Tombridge's mountain man expertise provided crucial documentation of supernatural serpent behavioral patterns, while his 43 years of wilderness survival experience enabled systematic observation and analysis of creature characteristics whose intelligence exceeded normal animal psychology through demonstrated strategic planning and psychological manipulation capabilities. His survival of multiple serpent encounters created unique understanding of supernatural predator methodology, while professional hunting knowledge enabled recognition of otherworldly rather than purely natural creature behavior, whose documentation provided essential intelligence for human defensive strategy development. The psychological torture methodology that distinguished supernatural serpent predation from normal animal attacks included systematic victim manipulation designed to maximize psychological trauma, while prolonged aquatic assault created conditions of extended terror whose duration exceeded efficient elimination to encompass deliberate suffering enhancement. The methodology included allowing victims partial escape opportunities before recapture, while creature behavior demonstrated sadistic pleasure in human fear response, whose intensity suggested supernatural psychology rather than purely instinctual predatory satisfaction through deliberate rather than accidental psychological manipulation techniques. The aquatic torture chambers that Serpent Dynasty utilized for victim processing included specific river locations, whose geographical characteristics enabled optimal psychological warfare deployment, while deep pools provided concealed operational space for extended victim manipulation that exceeded normal predatory timeframes. The chambers included natural rock formations and submerged cave systems, while environmental modifications demonstrated supernatural engineering capabilities whose sophistication exceeded normal animal territorial preparation through intelligent rather than instinctual environmental manipulation for enhanced predatory effectiveness. The inhuman vocalizations that characterized supernatural serpent communication included systematic shrieking, whose psychological impact exceeded normal animal sounds through otherworldly acoustic characteristics designed to induce permanent madness in human witnesses whose survival served strategic rather than accidental purposes. The vocalizations demonstrated supernatural control over acoustic environment, while their psychological effectiveness exceeded normal intimidation through direct consciousness manipulation, whose success enabled ongoing terror propagation throughout regional communities, whose collective fear enhanced supernatural territorial control and human elimination efficiency. The bloodline elimination strategy that Serpent Dynasty employed included systematic identification and targeting of extended family networks, whose destruction demonstrated supernatural memory capabilities and strategic intelligence that exceeded normal animal territorial behavior through multi-generational persecution, whose persistence required otherworldly rather than purely biological motivation. The strategy included tracking family movement across geographical distances, while supernatural reconnaissance capabilities enabled comprehensive victim location and identification, whose accuracy exceeded normal predatory tracking through otherworldly intelligence gathering and strategic planning, whose sophistication transcended animal capabilities. The adaptive learning demonstration that characterized advancing supernatural threat included systematic modification of hunting strategies based on human defensive responses, while creature intelligence enabled tactical innovation whose effectiveness exceeded original predatory methods through ongoing assessment and strategic refinement. The learning included countermeasures development against human protective techniques, while supernatural capabilities enabled enhanced predatory effectiveness through tactical adaptation, whose sophistication demonstrated strategic intelligence rather than purely instinctual behavioral modification, whose success enabled comprehensive human defensive measure circumvention. The supernatural family hierarchy that governed dynasty operations included eldest and largest creature, directing coordinated attacks by offspring whose individual territories encompassed specific river tributary systems, while collective coordination enabled comprehensive territorial coverage and systematic human elimination through hierarchical command structure. The hierarchy demonstrated supernatural social organization, while individual brood member specialization enabled optimal territorial exploitation through inherited supernatural abilities, whose combination created comprehensive aquatic dominance that challenged human community survival throughout entire White River system, whose control exceeded normal animal territorial establishment. The multi-location simultaneity that characterized advanced serpent attacks included coordinated strikes across geographical distances, while supernatural communication enabled real-time tactical coordination and strategic adaptation, whose effectiveness exceeded normal animal pack behavior through otherworldly intelligence sharing and collective decision-making. The simultaneity demonstrated supernatural coordination capabilities, while strategic timing enabled optimal psychological impact through community-wide recognition of comprehensive supernatural threat, whose scope exceeded individual creature capabilities through collective rather than purely individual supernatural manifestation. The survivor testimony documentation that provided crucial intelligence about supernatural predator characteristics included systematic recording of creature behavior patterns whose consistency exceeded normal animal variation through inherited supernatural traits and strategic intelligence, whose preservation enabled ongoing threat assessment and defensive strategy development. The testimony revealed creature preferences and vulnerability patterns, while survivor psychological trauma provided evidence of supernatural psychological warfare effectiveness, whose success enabled ongoing terror propagation throughout regional communities, whose collective fear enhanced creature territorial control and hunting effectiveness. The territorial expansion evidence that characterized dynasty operational development included systematic claiming of additional river tributaries, while supernatural coordination enabled comprehensive waterway control whose scope exceeded normal animal territorial establishment through strategic rather than opportunistic expansion patterns. The expansion demonstrated long-term strategic planning, while creature intelligence enabled optimal resource allocation and territorial management, whose effectiveness exceeded normal predatory territorial behavior through supernatural rather than purely biological territorial organization and control mechanisms. The human defensive measure inadequacy that became apparent through creature encounter documentation included systematic failure of conventional protective techniques, whose effectiveness proved insufficient against supernatural predators whose capabilities exceeded normal animal limitations through otherworldly intelligence and strategic coordination. The inadequacy revealed need for alternative protective approaches, while traditional frontier defensive methods required modification for supernatural threat management, whose characteristics transcended normal wilderness survival techniques through supernatural rather than purely natural predatory capabilities, whose effectiveness exceeded conventional human defensive preparation. The community terror propagation that resulted from systematic supernatural predation included psychological impact, whose intensity exceeded individual attack effects through collective recognition of comprehensive threat, whose scope challenged regional human settlement viability and commercial activity sustainability. The terror included social disruption and economic impact, while community psychological trauma created optimal conditions for ongoing supernatural territorial assertion through enhanced fear response and reduced human defensive capabilities, whose degradation enabled accelerated supernatural territorial control establishment. The strategic intelligence demonstration that characterized supernatural serpent family coordination included systematic exploitation of human social organization and psychological vulnerability, while creature understanding of community structure enabled optimal target selection and tactical deployment for maximum psychological and economic impact. The intelligence exceeded normal animal psychology through supernatural understanding of human civilization, whose exploitation enabled enhanced predatory effectiveness through strategic rather than random victim selection and tactical deployment, whose sophistication transcended normal predatory behavior through otherworldly rather than purely instinctual strategic planning capabilities. As the supernatural Serpent Dynasty initiated systematic family targeting campaign, whose coordinated methodology demonstrated otherworldly intelligence and vengeful purpose, while Tom Bridges' documentation revealed creature behavioral patterns whose psychological warfare capabilities exceeded normal animal predation through systematic torture and terror deployment designed to maximize human suffering rather than achieve efficient elimination. The Mitchell family persecution established precedent for kinship cruelty phenomenon, whose multi-generational scope challenged conventional understanding of animal territorial behavior while requiring acknowledgement of supernatural memory and strategic planning capabilities, whose effectiveness exceeded normal predatory intelligence through otherworldly rather than purely biological creature characteristics, whose recognition demanded innovative rather than conventional defensive strategies. The desperate expedition that Captain Blackwood and Reverend Ezekiel Stone launched into Serpent Dynasty territorial headquarters represented unprecedented attempt to locate supernatural threat operational center, while utilizing Tom Bridges' intelligence about massive underwater cave complex whose discovery required systematic exploration of submerged White River confluence areas where geological conditions enabled optimal supernatural lair construction. The 51-year-old traveling preacher's theological training provided spiritual framework for confronting otherworldly evil, while Captain Blackwood's riverboat expertise enabled navigation through treacherous underwater passages whose exploration revealed architectural sophistication that exceeded normal cave formation through supernatural rather than purely geological modification processes. The cave complex discovery that validated intelligence reports included systematic exploration of submerged limestone formations whose modification demonstrated supernatural engineering capabilities, while architectural elements revealed centuries of conscious development and strategic defensive preparation that exceeded normal animal lair construction. The complex included multiple chamber systems and underwater passages, while environmental conditions demonstrated supernatural atmosphere control and temperature regulation whose sophistication exceeded normal cave characteristics through otherworldly rather than purely natural environmental modification, whose purposes included optimal supernatural habitation and defensive positioning against human intrusion attempts. The patriarch's serpent manifestation that occurred within primary chamber included encounter with ancient creature whose 80-foot length exceeded previously documented supernatural entity dimensions, while its 2-century lifespan provided comprehensive understanding of regional territorial history and human settlement patterns, whose knowledge enabled strategic supernatural resistance against European territorial expansion. The creature's supernatural abilities included size modification and atmospheric manipulation, while its psychological influence capabilities exceeded normal animal intimidation through direct consciousness control and hypnotic domination, whose effectiveness transcended physical threat to encompass mental and spiritual corruption of human investigative personnel. The horrifying evidence documentation that cave exploration revealed included systematic arrangement of human skeletal remains, whose organization demonstrated ritualistic rather than nutritional consumption patterns, while victim positioning suggested ceremonial significance that exceeded normal predatory behavior through supernatural rather than purely animal motivations. The evidence included hundreds of victims spanning multiple decades, while bone arrangement patterns revealed creature intelligence and systematic record-keeping, whose purposes included territorial claim documentation and multi-generational human elimination tracking, whose scope exceeded normal animal territorial marking through otherworldly rather than purely biological territorial assertion. Methods. The ritualistic consumption indicators that skeletal evidence revealed included systematic victim processing whose characteristics exceeded normal predation through ceremonial elements and symbolic arrangement patterns that suggested supernatural rather than purely nutritional motivations for human elimination. The indicators included specific bone positioning and ceremonial artifact arrangement, while evidence suggested creature satisfaction derived from psychological and spiritual rather than purely physical consumption, whose purposes transcended normal predatory satisfaction through otherworldly rather than purely biological feeding requirements, whose fulfillment demanded human terror and spiritual contamination rather than simple physical nourishment. The carved documentation system that cave walls revealed included systematic record-keeping, whose sophistication exceeded normal animal territorial marking through symbolic communication and historical documentation that suggested supernatural intelligence and long-term strategic planning capabilities. The carvings included family bloodline tracking and elimination records, while symbolic elements revealed creature understanding of human social organization, whose exploitation enabled optimal victim selection and psychological warfare deployment through systematic targeting of community leadership and economic infrastructure, whose destruction enabled comprehensive territorial control. Establishment. Reverend Stone's Christian intervention attempts that proved inadequate against primordial supernatural entity included systematic application of traditional exorcism procedures whose effectiveness remained limited against otherworldly forces whose authority predated Christian territorial claims and operated according to indigenous rather than European spiritual principles. His theological training provided limited understanding of pre-Christian supernatural entities, while traditional Christian protective measures proved insufficient against creature whose spiritual authority transcended contemporary religious jurisdiction through ancient, rather than modern, supernatural legitimacy, whose acknowledgement required integration of indigenous spiritual knowledge with Christian faith. The supernatural ability demonstration that patriarch creature revealed during confrontation included systematic manifestation of otherworldly capabilities whose scope exceeded normal animal limitations through size modification, environmental control, and psychological manipulation whose effectiveness transcended physical threat to encompass comprehensive supernatural dominance over human consciousness and spiritual condition. The abilities included shape-shifting and atmospheric manipulation, while creatures' hypnotic influence enabled direct mental control, whose success demonstrated supernatural psychology and strategic intelligence that exceeded normal predatory capabilities through otherworldly rather than purely biological supernatural enhancement. The aquatic surveillance network that Patriarch commanded included systematic deployment of lesser creatures and environmental manipulation, whose effectiveness enabled comprehensive territorial monitoring and human activity tracking that exceeded normal animal territorial awareness through supernatural rather than purely natural intelligence gathering capabilities. The network included fish and amphibian coordination, while environmental control enabled optimal surveillance coverage whose scope encompassed entire White River system through supernatural rather than purely biological coordination mechanisms whose effectiveness exceeded normal animal territorial organization through otherworldly command and control capabilities. The territorial history revelation that creature knowledge provided included systematic understanding of regional human settlement patterns and indigenous population displacement, whose documentation enabled strategic supernatural resistance against continued European territorial expansion through accumulated knowledge and multi-generational strategic planning. The history included detailed awareness of family bloodlines and community economic organization, while creature intelligence enabled optimal target selection and psychological warfare deployment through comprehensive understanding of human social vulnerability and defensive limitation, whose exploitation enabled enhanced supernatural territorial control and human elimination effectiveness. The environmental modification evidence that Cave Complex revealed included systematic architectural enhancement and atmospheric control, whose sophistication exceeded normal animal territorial preparation through supernatural engineering capabilities and long-term strategic planning that enabled optimal defensive positioning and operational effectiveness. The modifications included water flow control and chamber atmosphere regulation, while defensive positioning demonstrated strategic intelligence and military understanding, whose application enabled comprehensive protection against human intrusion attempts through otherworldly rather than purely natural defensive preparation, whose effectiveness exceeded normal animal territorial protection methods. The primordial spiritual authority that Patriarch creature claimed included territorial rights, whose legitimacy predated European settlement and Christian religious authority, while ancient spiritual connections enabled supernatural capabilities and territorial control that challenged contemporary human understanding of appropriate land use and resource access. The authority included indigenous spiritual connections, while creatures' ancient origins provided legitimate territorial claims, whose acknowledgement required recognition of pre-Christian supernatural reality and appropriate respectful protocols, whose violation justified ongoing supernatural resistance and human elimination through territorial assertion and protective defense. The psychological warfare sophistication that creature demonstrated throughout confrontation included systematic exploitation of human fear and spiritual vulnerability, while supernatural psychological manipulation exceeded normal intimidation through direct consciousness control and hypnotic domination, whose effectiveness enabled comprehensive mental and spiritual corruption of investigative personnel. The warfare included atmospheric manipulation and environmental control, while creatures' understanding of human psychology enabled optimal terror deployment and strategic intimidation, whose purposes serve territorial assertion and human elimination through psychological rather than purely physical supernatural assault, whose effectiveness exceeded normal predatory intimidation capabilities. The strategic intelligence revelation that confrontation provided included creature understanding of human military organization and defensive capabilities, while supernatural tactical knowledge enabled optimal countermeasure development and strategic positioning for comprehensive territorial defense against human intrusion attempts. The intelligence included awareness of contemporary human technology and social organization, while creatures' strategic planning capabilities enabled systematic human elimination through coordinated family targeting and psychological warfare, whose effectiveness exceeded normal animal territorial defense through supernatural rather than purely biological defensive coordination and strategic deployment. The otherworldly command structure that cave exploration revealed included systematic organization of supernatural Serpent Dynasty, whose hierarchical coordination enabled comprehensive territorial control and strategic human elimination through collective intelligence and coordinated tactical deployment that exceeded individual creature capabilities. The structure included specialized territorial assignments and coordinated attack patterns, while supernatural communication enabled real-time tactical coordination and strategic adaptation, whose effectiveness exceeded normal animal pack organization through otherworldly, rather than purely biological coordination mechanisms, whose sophistication transcended normal animal social organization through supernatural command and control capabilities. The territorial violation consequences that creature knowledge revealed included systematic supernatural response to continued human intrusion and environmental disruption, whose escalation would encompass comprehensive human elimination and territorial reclamation through coordinated supernatural warfare, whose scope exceeded current psychological intimidation to encompass direct physical elimination of all human presence throughout White River system. The consequences included environmental restoration and spiritual territorial purification, while creatures' long-term strategic planning enabled systematic human elimination, whose success would restore pre-European territorial conditions and spiritual balance through comprehensive supernatural intervention and territorial reclamation, whose implementation required ongoing coordination and strategic deployment of enhanced supernatural capabilities. As Captain Blackwood and Reverend Stone's cave exploration revealed, Patriarch Serpent's ancient territorial authority and comprehensive intelligence regarding regional human settlement patterns, while creatures' supernatural capabilities exceeded Christian protective measures through primordial spiritual legitimacy that predated European religious authority. The horrifying evidence of centuries-long systematic human elimination and ritualistic consumption demonstrated otherworldly rather than purely animal motivations, whose acknowledgement required recognition of legitimate spiritual territorial claims, whose violation justified ongoing supernatural resistance, while creatures' strategic intelligence and coordinated family organization enabled comprehensive territorial control, whose effectiveness challenged human community survival throughout entire White River system through systematic psychological warfare and coordinated elimination campaigns. The escalating supernatural crisis that characterized Serpent Dynasty territorial dominance included systematic elimination of human river communities, whose survival required immediate evacuation, while remaining settlements faced comprehensive aquatic siege, whose effectiveness exceeded normal predatory pressure through coordinated supernatural warfare designed to eliminate all human presence. Throughout White River system, Little Owl's recognition of environmental omens whose significance transcended normal seasonal variations included atmospheric disturbances and wildlife behavior modifications that indicated thunder beings' preparation for supernatural intervention to restore spiritual balance between opposing otherworldly forces whose conflict threatened regional ecological stability through escalating supernatural warfare. The thunder beings' spiritual significance within Cherokee cosmology included supernatural forces governing atmospheric and celestial phenomena whose authority transcended earthbound spiritual entities, while their intervention capabilities enabled restoration of natural balance through direct supernatural conflict resolution that exceeded normal spiritual mediation. The thunder beings represented sky-based supernatural authority, whose territorial claims encompassed atmospheric and celestial domains, while their traditional role included maintaining spiritual equilibrium between competing otherworldly forces whose conflict required divine rather than earthly intervention for successful resolution and territorial balance restoration. The corrupted underwater panther descendants revelation that Little Owl's spiritual investigation provided included systematic understanding of Serpent Dynasty origins as degraded manifestations of traditional water spirit protectors whose supernatural authority had been perverted through centuries of accumulated resentment against human territorial violation and environmental disruption. The corruption included abandonment of traditional protective responsibilities, while ancient spiritual entities had transformed from guardians into predators through systematic exposure to human violence and ecological destruction, whose cumulative effects created supernatural malevolence that exceeded normal water spirit territorial behavior. The environmental omens interpretation that Cherokee spiritual knowledge enabled included systematic recognition of atmospheric and natural phenomena whose characteristics indicated impending supernatural intervention, while traditional understanding provided framework for anticipating thunder beings' manifestation and territorial conflict resolution. The omens included electromagnetic atmospheric disturbances and wildlife migration patterns, while environmental conditions demonstrated supernatural preparation for climactic confrontation between opposing spiritual forces whose resolution would determine ongoing territorial authority and human settlement viability throughout regional river system. The spiritual ceremony escalation that Little Owl's desperate intervention included systematic implementation of traditional Cherokee protective rituals whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual mediation through direct communication with thunder beings, whose intervention represented optimal resolution for supernatural territorial conflict that threatened regional ecological balance. The ceremonies included sacred smoking and prayer protocols, while traditional spiritual authority enabled appropriate supernatural communication whose success required authentic indigenous spiritual connection and proper ceremonial implementation according to Cherokee cosmological understanding and traditional spiritual practice. The simultaneous attack coordination that Serpent Dynasty demonstrated throughout regional river system included systematic manifestation across multiple tributaries, while synchronized supernatural warfare exceeded previous psychological intimidation to encompass direct physical elimination attempts whose scope threatened complete human evacuation from entire White River watershed. The coordination demonstrated peak supernatural capabilities, while collective dynasty intelligence enabled comprehensive tactical deployment and strategic positioning that exceeded normal animal territorial assertion through otherworldly command and control, whose effectiveness challenged human community survival and regional commercial viability. The supernatural territorial reclamation that Serpent Dynasty's strategic objectives revealed included systematic elimination of all human presence throughout ancestral water territories, while environmental restoration required comprehensive removal of European settlement infrastructure and commercial activity whose continuation violated traditional spiritual territorial agreements. The reclamation included re-establishment of pre-contact ecological conditions, while supernatural intervention would restore original spiritual balance through elimination of human territorial violation, whose continuation threatened ancient spiritual authority and traditional territorial sovereignty over water resources and aquatic ecosystems. The community evacuation that mounting supernatural pressure necessitated included systematic abandonment of riverside settlements whose survival required immediate relocation, while remaining human populations faced aquatic siege whose intensity exceeded normal predatory threat through coordinated supernatural warfare designed to eliminate rather than simply intimidate human territorial presence. The evacuation demonstrated supernatural effectiveness, while community recognition of overwhelming otherworldly threat created acknowledgement that human defensive capabilities proved inadequate against coordinated supernatural territorial assertion, whose success would eliminate regional human settlement and commercial activity. The traditional spiritual authority that Cherokee knowledge systems provided included understanding of appropriate protocols for supernatural territorial conflict resolution, while indigenous spiritual practices offered potential mediation between opposing otherworldly forces whose conflict required respectful acknowledgement of legitimate territorial claims and proper spiritual intervention. The authority included traditional ceremonial procedures, while Cherokee cosmological understanding enabled appropriate supernatural communication whose effectiveness exceeded European religious approaches through authentic, rather than imposed spiritual connection with traditional otherworldly entities governing natural resources and territorial sovereignty. The Thunder Being's communication that Little Owl's ceremonies enabled included systematic spiritual contact with atmospheric supernatural forces whose intervention authority exceeded earthbound spiritual entities, while their traditional role included restoration of natural balance through direct conflict resolution between opposing otherworldly territorial claims. The communication revealed Thunder Being's recognition of legitimate water spirit territorial rights, while acknowledging that Serpent Dynasty corruption required intervention to restore traditional spiritual balance and prevent continued ecological disruption through supernatural warfare, whose escalation threatened regional environmental stability. The spiritual warfare preparation that characterized advancing supernatural conflict included systematic mobilization of opposing otherworldly forces, while Thunder Being's intervention required comprehensive atmospheric manipulation and celestial energy deployment, whose effectiveness exceeded earthbound supernatural capabilities through divine rather than terrestrial spiritual authority. The preparation included electromagnetic atmospheric charging, while environmental conditions demonstrated supernatural force accumulation whose intensity exceeded normal weather phenomena through otherworldly rather than purely natural atmospheric manipulation designed for climactic supernatural confrontation resolution. The peak serpent capabilities that crisis escalation revealed included supernatural coordination, whose scope encompassed entire river system, while dynasty intelligence enabled comprehensive tactical deployment and strategic positioning that exceeded previous manifestation through collective otherworldly enhancement and coordinated family supernatural abilities. The capabilities included environmental manipulation and psychological warfare, while Serpent Dynasty demonstrated territorial authority, whose effectiveness challenged human community survival through systematic elimination and comprehensive aquatic dominance, whose success would establish permanent supernatural territorial control over regional water resources. The environmental contamination that escalating supernatural warfare created included systematic disruption of regional ecological balance, while opposing otherworldly forces generated atmospheric and aquatic disturbances whose intensity exceeded normal environmental stress through supernatural rather than purely natural phenomena affecting regional ecosystem stability. The contamination included water quality degradation and atmospheric electromagnetic disturbance, while supernatural warfare generated environmental conditions that threatened regional ecological survival through otherworldly rather than purely natural environmental manipulation, whose effects transcended immediate supernatural territorial conflict. The territorial sovereignty recognition that spiritual crisis required included acknowledgement of legitimate indigenous supernatural authority over traditional water territories, while European settlement patterns had systematically violated spiritual territorial agreements, whose restoration demanded respectful coexistence rather than continued dominance through recognition of otherworldly territorial rights. The recognition included understanding of appropriate spiritual protocols, while traditional territorial agreements required ongoing respectful acknowledgement of supernatural authority over natural resources whose access demanded proper spiritual relationship maintenance, rather than purely exploitative resource extraction. The divine intervention necessity that crisis escalation revealed included requirement for supernatural conflict resolution, whose scope exceeded earthbound spiritual mediation, while Thunder Being's intervention represented optimal balance restoration between opposing otherworldly forces, whose territorial conflict threatened regional environmental stability. The necessity included recognition that human survival required respectful acknowledgement of spiritual territorial rights, while continued violation would justify comprehensive supernatural elimination through divine rather than earthbound spiritual intervention, whose authority exceeded normal supernatural territorial assertion through celestial rather than terrestrial otherworldly power. Deployment. The climactic preparation that environmental omens indicated included systematic spiritual force accumulation, while opposing supernatural entities prepared for definitive territorial conflict resolution, whose outcome would determine ongoing human settlement viability and spiritual territorial sovereignty throughout regional river system. The preparation included atmospheric energy charging, while supernatural force mobilization exceeded normal otherworldly manifestation through divine intervention. Preparation, whose scope encompassed comprehensive territorial balance. Restoration through climactic supernatural confrontation, whose resolution would establish permanent rather than temporary spiritual territorial authority. And appropriate human coexistence protocols, as Little Owl's desperate ceremonies enabled communication with Thunder Beings, whose intervention authority exceeded earthbound supernatural entities, while Serpent Dynasty territorial dominance threatened complete human elimination from regional river system through coordinated supernatural warfare, whose effectiveness exceeded normal animal territorial assertion. The environmental omens and spiritual preparation indicated impending climactic confrontation between opposing otherworldly forces, whose resolution would determine ongoing territorial sovereignty and human settlement viability through divine rather than earthbound spiritual intervention, whose scope encompassed comprehensive ecological balance restoration and appropriate spiritual territorial agreement re-establishment, whose success required respectful acknowledgement of indigenous supernatural authority over traditional water territories. The climactic supernatural confrontation that erupted during unprecedented atmospheric disturbance included systematic manifestation of Thunder Beings, whose celestial authority enabled direct intervention in territorial conflict, between corrupted water spirits and human settlement communities, whose survival required divine rather than earthbound spiritual mediation for restoration of ecological balance. The thunderstorm itself transcended normal meteorological phenomena through supernatural atmospheric manipulation whose intensity exceeded natural weather patterns, while electromagnetic energy discharge demonstrated otherworldly rather than purely natural forces engaging in primordial spiritual warfare whose scope encompassed comprehensive territorial balance restoration through climactic confrontation between opposing spiritual authorities. The thunder being's manifestation that characterized divine intervention included systematic deployment of celestial supernatural forces whose authority exceeded earthbound spiritual entities, while atmospheric control capabilities enabled comprehensive environmental manipulation for restoration of natural balance through direct conflict with corrupted water spirits whose territorial dominance violated traditional spiritual agreements. The manifestation included lightning entity deployment and electromagnetic atmospheric charging, while divine intervention demonstrated superior supernatural authority whose effectiveness exceeded normal spiritual mediation through direct rather than indirect spiritual warfare, whose scope encompassed definitive territorial conflict resolution. The Serpent Dynasty resistance that opposing divine intervention included systematic deployment of peak supernatural capabilities, while patriarch creature coordination with offspring enabled comprehensive aquatic defensive measures whose effectiveness exceeded previous manifestation through collective otherworldly enhancement and strategic positioning for climactic territorial defense. The resistance included environmental manipulation and psychological warfare, while Dynasty's supernatural abilities enabled tactical coordination whose sophistication exceeded normal animal territorial defense through otherworldly rather than purely biological defensive capabilities whose deployment represented peak supernatural manifestation and territorial assertion. The primordial spiritual warfare that characterized climactic confrontation included systematic engagement between opposing supernatural forces whose authority transcended normal territorial mediation, while ancient spiritual entities engaged in definitive combat whose outcome would determine ongoing territorial sovereignty and ecological balance throughout regional river system. The warfare exceeded normal supernatural manifestation through divine rather than earthbound spiritual authority, while atmospheric and aquatic supernatural forces engaged in comprehensive territorial conflict whose resolution required superior rather than equivalent otherworldly power deployment for definitive territorial authority establishment. The environmental destruction that accompanied supernatural warfare included systematic disruption of regional ecosystem whose intensity exceeded normal environmental stress through otherworldly rather than purely natural phenomena affecting comprehensive territorial conditions and ecological stability. The destruction included geological modification and atmospheric disruption, while supernatural warfare generated environmental changes whose permanence exceeded temporary disturbance through definitive rather than reversible ecological modification, whose effects would influence ongoing regional environmental conditions and human settlement viability through permanent rather than temporary territorial modification. The human witness testimony that documented supernatural confrontation included systematic observation of otherworldly forces whose manifestation exceeded normal comprehension, while surviving community members witnessed primordial spiritual warfare whose scope transcended earthly territorial conflict through divine intervention and comprehensive supernatural authority deployment. The testimony provided crucial documentation while witness survival enabled historical preservation of supernatural confrontation whose significance exceeded local territorial conflict to encompass fundamental spiritual territorial authority establishment and ecological balance restoration through divine rather than earthbound spiritual intervention. The Serpent Dynasty elimination that Thunder Being's intervention achieved included systematic destruction of corrupted water spirit entities whose territorial dominance had violated traditional spiritual agreements, while divine supernatural authority enabled definitive territorial conflict resolution through superior rather than equivalent otherworldly power deployment. The elimination included patriarch creature destruction and offspring neutralization, while Thunder Being's intervention demonstrated celestial spiritual authority whose effectiveness exceeded earthbound supernatural resistance through comprehensive rather than partial supernatural territorial authority, establishment, and ecological balance restoration. The territorial balance restoration that divine intervention accomplished included systematic re-establishment of appropriate spiritual territorial agreements, while ecological conditions received comprehensive restoration through supernatural environmental modification whose permanence exceeded temporary conflict resolution. The restoration included water territory, spiritual purification, while appropriate territorial sovereignty enabled ongoing human settlement according to respectful rather than exploitative relationship protocols whose maintenance required acknowledgement of indigenous spiritual authority over natural resources and territorial access, whose violation might justify future supernatural intervention. The ecosystem transformation that supernatural warfare consequences included systematic modification of regional environmental conditions whose permanence exceeded temporary disturbance through otherworldly rather than purely natural ecological change, whose effects would influence ongoing regional settlement patterns and commercial activity. The transformation included river system modification and atmospheric condition alteration, while environmental changes created ongoing recognition of supernatural territorial authority whose acknowledgement required respectful rather than exploitative human relationship with natural resources, whose access demanded proper spiritual protocol maintenance. The human settlement modification that territorial balance restoration required included systematic recognition of appropriate coexistence protocols, while surviving communities acknowledged indigenous spiritual authority over traditional water territories, whose access demanded respectful rather than dominance-based relationship maintenance. The modification included settlement pattern adjustment and commercial activity limitation, while human survival required ongoing acknowledgement of supernatural territorial sovereignty, whose violation might justify renewed otherworldly intervention through recognition of legitimate spiritual territorial rights and appropriate respectful coexistence maintenance. Captain Blackwood's survival testimony that provided crucial documentation included systematic recording of supernatural confrontation whose scope exceeded normal territorial conflict, while his riverboat expertise enabled professional assessment of environmental changes and ongoing territorial condition modification whose permanence affected regional commercial viability and transportation infrastructure. His testimony preserved essential historical information, while professional experience validated supernatural confrontation observations, whose significance exceeded local folklore to encompass genuine spiritual territorial authority, establishment, and appropriate human relationship protocol requirements. Sarah Mitchell's family survival that represented partial resolution included recognition that supernatural intervention had eliminated immediate aquatic threat, while ongoing territorial balance required respectful acknowledgement of spiritual authority over water resources, whose access demanded proper protocol maintenance rather than purely exploitative resource extraction. Her survival enabled family line continuation, while acknowledging that ongoing human settlement required respectful coexistence with supernatural territorial sovereignty, whose violation might justify renewed otherworldly intervention through appropriate spiritual relationship maintenance and territorial respect demonstration. The ongoing folklore establishment that confrontation resolution created included systematic community recognition of supernatural territorial authority, while traditional knowledge preservation enabled future generations to maintain appropriate respectful relationships with otherworldly forces governing natural resources and territorial sovereignty. The folklore included protective protocol documentation, while community education emphasized respectful rather than exploitative relationship maintenance, whose effectiveness required ongoing acknowledgement of indigenous spiritual authority over traditional territorial claims, whose violation might justify supernatural intervention through territorial assertion and human elimination campaigns. The spiritual territorial agreement that divine intervention established included systematic protocols for ongoing human settlement, whose sustainability required respectful acknowledgement of supernatural authority over water resources, while appropriate coexistence demanded ongoing recognition of indigenous spiritual territorial sovereignty, whose violation might justify renewed otherworldly intervention. The agreement included specific behavioral requirements, while human survival demanded careful maintenance of respectful relationships with supernatural territorial authorities, whose legitimacy exceeded European settlement claims through traditional rather than imposed spiritual territorial sovereignty. The descendant warning system that community folklore preservation created included systematic education about potential supernatural threat re-emergence, while traditional knowledge transmission enabled future recognition of otherworldly territorial assertion, whose response required appropriate respectful protocols rather than defensive resistance, whose inadequacy had been demonstrated through previous supernatural confrontation. The warning included protective behavior guidelines, while community survival required ongoing vigilance regarding spiritual territorial boundaries, whose violation might justify renewed supernatural intervention through territorial assertion and human elimination, whose prevention demanded respectful rather than exploitative relationship maintenance. The environmental monitoring that ongoing territorial balance required included systematic observation of natural phenomena whose modification might indicate supernatural territorial assertion, while community awareness enabled early recognition of otherworldly manifestation whose response demanded appropriate respectful protocol implementation rather than defensive resistance. The monitoring included traditional ecological knowledge preservation, while indigenous spiritual understanding provided interpretive framework for supernatural territorial activity whose management required respectful acknowledgement rather than confrontational resistance, whose inadequacy exceeded conventional defensive capabilities through supernatural rather than purely natural territorial authority establishment. As the Thunder Being's supernatural intervention achieved comprehensive elimination of corrupted Serpent Dynasty while establishing definitive spiritual territorial balance through divine rather than earthbound supernatural authority whose effectiveness exceeded normal territorial mediation. The climactic environmental destruction had created permanent ecological modification whose effects influenced ongoing human settlement patterns, while territorial balance restoration required respectful acknowledgement of indigenous spiritual authority over traditional water territories, whose access demanded proper protocol maintenance rather than purely exploitative resource extraction, whose Continuation might justify renewed supernatural intervention through territorial assertion and comprehensive human elimination, whose prevention required ongoing respectful coexistence and appropriate spiritual relationship maintenance with other worldly forces governing regional natural resources and territorial sovereignty.